Polystation. If you grew up in certain parts of Latin America, Africa, or Asia, there's a good chance you've seen the infamous Polystation sitting in a small electronics shop or a market stall. At first glance, it looked like a perfect replica of Sony's original PlayStation. Same gray plastic shell, same button layout, even the familiar circle disc lid on top. But here's where the illusion fell apart. Open that disc tray, and you wouldn't find a place for CDs at all. Instead, there was a slot for old school Famicom cartridges. The Polystation was not a PlayStation in any sense. It was a full-fledged Nintendo Famicom clone hiding inside a PlayStation shell. It came preloaded with cheap 8-bit games, often bundled with a light gun, and ran off technology that was already a decade old. But in countries where the real PlayStation was too expensive or hard to find, the Polystation became a bizarre alternative. Manufactured by unlicensed companies, it preyed on parents who didn't know the difference, promising modern gaming at a fraction of the cost. Some even featured box art with actual PlayStation game covers, despite being incapable of running anything remotely close to them. Over time, the Polystation became a pop culture meme, a symbol of video game knockoffs done so convincingly that you almost had to respect the audacity. Atari Pong vs Magnavox Odyssey. Long before Nintendo and Sega were household names, the very first big gaming lawsuit set the tone for the entire industry, and it all started with a simple game of digital table tennis. In 1972, Magnavox released the Odyssey, the world's first home video game console. One of its most popular games was table tennis, a minimalist match of bouncing a square ball back and forth between two paddles. Just a year later, Atari burst onto the scene with Pong, an arcade hit that looked and played just like the Odyssey's table tennis. Magnavox noticed. They accused Atari of copying not just the concept, but the way it played and felt. Atari's defense didn't hold up. Magnavox had the patents to prove they'd been there first. In 1974, faced with a lawsuit they knew they'd likely lose, Atari settled out of court, reportedly paying Magnavox millions in licensing fees. This case wasn't just about money. It was the first time video game cloning had real legal consequences. It also cemented Atari's place in gaming history, proving that even the companies that helped define the industry weren't above borrowing ideas. In a strange twist, Pong's success may have actually helped popularize the Odyssey's concept, even if it was at Magnavox's expense. Dendy. In the early 1990s, while the United States and Japan were moving into the 16-bit era with the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, Russia was just getting its first taste of the 8-bit revolution, thanks to a console called the Dendy. On the outside, it looked like an ordinary Famicom, but this was no official Nintendo product. It was an unlicensed clone, built to run Famicom cartridges perfectly, and marketed to a country where Nintendo had no official presence. Launched in 1992 by a company called Steepler, the Dendy became a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. It wasn't cheap by Russian standards, but it was far more affordable than importing real Nintendo hardware. It came bundled with classics like Duck Hunt and Super Mario Bros., plus a light gun and controllers identical to the Famicom's design. For millions of Russian kids, this was Nintendo, even if they had no idea it wasn't the real thing. What made the Dendy so successful wasn't just the hardware, it was the marketing. Steepler ran TV ads, produced branded magazines, and even had a mascot, a friendly cartoon elephant. In a country where owning Western tech was still a novelty, the Dendy didn't just copy the Famicom. It became the face of gaming itself for an entire generation. Hyperkin Retron series. By the 2010s, nostalgia for retro gaming was booming, and companies started looking for ways to sell classic experiences to modern audiences. Enter the Hyperkin Retron series, a line of consoles that could play original NES, SNES, Genesis, and other retro cartridges all in one machine. It sounded like the perfect legal solution for gamers who still had their old games but no longer owned the original hardware. But here's the catch. The way it worked was eerily similar to the way classic console clones operated decades earlier. The Retron consoles weren't licensed by Nintendo, Sega, or any other original manufacturer. Instead, they relied on reverse-engineered hardware and emulation technology to run those cartridges. The design and function were a direct copy of what older systems did, just packaged in a sleek, modern shell with HDMI output. While Hyperkin operated in a legal gray area, they were careful about branding and marketing, avoiding the outright counterfeiting that earlier clones were guilty of. Still, the Retron's ability to mimic so many classic systems made it the spiritual successor to the clone consoles of the 80s and 90s, just with modern polish. For many gamers, it was a convenient way to revisit their childhood, but for others, it was another reminder that cloning never really went away, it just got more sophisticated. Allied Leisure vs Midway. Before home consoles dominated living rooms, the arcade industry was the Wild West, and copying someone else's hit game was practically a business model. In 1973, Allied Leisure released Paddle Battle, a coin-operated table tennis game clearly inspired by Pong. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was popular enough to draw attention. That attention came from Midway, a company eager to cash in on the craze. Midway's answer was Winner 4, a near-identical 4-player version that looked, played, and even sounded like Paddle Battle. Allied Leisure wasn't amused. They accused Midway of outright copying their circuit board design and game mechanics, sparking one of the earliest known arcade hardware disputes. While the legal fight didn't achieve the lasting fame of Atari's clash with Magnavox, it highlighted how rampant cloning was in the early gaming market. Back then, intellectual property law for games was shaky at best. Many companies figured they could get away with lifting ideas wholesale because the technology was so new. Winner 4 and Paddle Battle are now obscure footnotes in history, but they represent a critical chapter in the copycat culture that shaped gaming's earliest days, when innovation and imitation were often separated by little more than a soldering iron. I'll be posting videos daily, so be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more video game explainer videos. Pegasus. In the early 1990s, Eastern Europe was opening up to global markets, but official gaming hardware from companies like Nintendo was still rare and expensive. That gap created the perfect opportunity for the Pegasus, a Polish-made Famiclone that became a household name in the region. At first glance, it looked a lot like Nintendo's Famicom, right down to the cartridge slot and controller ports. But under the hood, it was an unlicensed copy, built to play NES and Famicom games without Nintendo's permission. The Pegasus wasn't just some shady market knockoff, it was a full-scale brand. It was sold in major electronics stores, advertised on television, and packaged with bright, flashy artwork that made it feel like a legitimate product. Many parents had no idea they were buying their kids a clone, and for the kids themselves, it didn't matter. The Pegasus played Super Mario Bros., Contra, and Duck Hunt, so as far as they were concerned, it was the real deal. Its popularity also created a secondary market for pirated game cartridges, often with multiple titles crammed onto a single chip. By the mid-90s, the Pegasus had cemented itself as Poland's unofficial Nintendo, proof that a good copy, sold at the right time, could become just as iconic as the original. Chinese UMC Famiclones. When Nintendo's Famicom exploded in popularity during the 1980s, it was only a matter of time before tech-savvy manufacturers in Asia tried to replicate it. In Taiwan, a semiconductor company called UMC took cloning to a whole new level. Instead of just copying the outer shell or controller design, UMC reverse-engineered the Famicom's most important components, the CPU and PPU chips that powered the entire system. By recreating these chips without Nintendo's permission, UMC made it possible for other factories to mass-produce Famicom clones cheaply and reliably. These weren't just lookalikes, they were fully functional duplicates capable of running almost every NES or Famicom game. Once the designs were out, the clones spread across China, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and South America under countless brand names. For many developing markets, these UMC-based clones became the default entry point into gaming. They often came bundled with multi-cards offering dozens or even hundreds of games, most of them pirated. While Nintendo's official consoles remain a luxury item, UMC's work ensured that a much cheaper version of Nintendo's 8-bit magic could be found in markets and toy stores worldwide. It was corporate copying at a microchip level, and it fueled the global clone boom for years to come. Broad bootleg console clones. While Nintendo's Famicom was the most frequently copied console in history, it wasn't the only one to fall victim to cloning. Throughout the 80s and 90s, entire families of bootleg systems emerged, targeting any popular console that had demand but limited availability. The Atari 2600 was cloned extensively, often under different names or other generic brands, offering dozens of built-in games, most of them unlicensed. Sega's Mega Drive/Genesis also saw a wave of unauthorized copies, many of which were sold in South America and parts of Asia. Even handhelds weren't safe. The Game Boy had endless knockoffs, some with transparent shells, others with wild color schemes to hide their stolen design. The SNES was cloned into bizarre, off-brand systems that promised super 16-bit graphics, but often ran pirated ROMs on cheaper hardware. These clones typically thrived in markets where official distributors never bothered to set up shop, creating a vacuum that counterfeiters were more than happy to fill. Some were blatant ripoffs meant to trick buyers, while others were just bare bones, low-cost ways to experience popular games. Together, they created a parallel gaming market, one where official often didn't matter, as long as it played the hits. Retro Duo/Gen X. By the late 2000s, retro gaming had moved from dusty attics into the mainstream, and companies saw an opportunity to cash in. That's where systems like the Retro Duo and Gen X came in. Modern-looking, plug-and-play consoles designed to run old NES, SNES, or Sega Genesis cartridges. At first glance, they seemed like a legal, nostalgia-driven product. But much like the clone consoles of the 80s and 90s, these devices were built without official licensing from Nintendo or Sega. Instead, they relied on reverse-engineered hardware and, in some cases, software-based emulation to mimic the original consoles. The Retro Duo became especially popular among collectors who wanted a single system to play multiple libraries without juggling cables or hardware. The Gen X offered similar functionality, appealing to Sega and Nintendo fans. While they didn't pretend to be the original systems, their entire business model was still based on copying the functionality of existing consoles. This made them a spiritual continuation of the clone market, just updated for a more nostalgic, tech-savvy audience. They proved that even decades after the first hardware knockoffs, there was still a massive demand for one system to play them all, even if it wasn't officially sanctioned. Overcal. After the North American video game crash of 1983, many major companies either folded or scaled back operations. But in some parts of the world, smaller manufacturers saw this as an opportunity to flood the market with cheap, copied hardware. One of the strangest examples was the Overcal, a Spanish clone of the Magnavox Odyssey. The original Odyssey, released in 1972, was already outdated by the mid-80s, but that didn't stop the Overcal from showing up in toy stores. It mimicked the Odyssey's bulky white casing and came with the same style of game cards, controllers, and plastic screen overlays. The biggest difference was branding. Overcal had its own logo, Spanish language packaging, and a marketing push targeted directly at families who had never seen the real Odyssey. Because Magnavox had largely exited the Spanish market, the Overcal didn't face much legal pushback. For many kids in Spain, this was their first console, unaware they were playing on a knockoff of a system that was over a decade old. It's one of the clearest examples of how cloning wasn't just about stealing cutting-edge tech. Sometimes it was about repackaging the past and selling it as brand new. If you made it this far, leave a comment and tell me the first video game console you ever owned. Thanks for watching.